Does human trafficking happen in your state? Does it happen down the street from where you live? Could you have possibly walked right past a human trafficking victim and not realized it? We'll be discussing all this and more on today's Dragonfly Home Human Trafficking podcast. Hey everybody, welcome to today's episode of the Dragonfly Human Trafficking podcast. Hello, Whitney.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Sitting in with us is Gator, the famous weenie dog mascot of the Dragonfly Home. He has a lot to offer.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of expertise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I'm Melissa, and I am the Director of Communications and Development for the Dragonfly Home.
And I am Whitney. I'm the Executive Director of the Dragonfly Home.
We decided to start this podcast in honor of Human Trafficking Awareness Month, which is every January. And we're going to be addressing our month-long campaign, which is called Getting to the Truth, Common Misconceptions About Human Trafficking. So today we're going to be talking about our first misconception, which is trafficking does not happen in my state, and it certainly doesn't happen to American citizens.
So the truth is that both sex and labor trafficking happen in all 50 states in the United States. And I would suggest that you all, if you're interested in finding out more data on your own state, visit the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They have great information. So victims are sometimes from other countries, but often we're working with American citizens of any gender, age, race, and socioeconomic status. So we want to emphasize really throughout this entire podcast that there is no one face to a victim. There is no one face to a perpetrator or to a sex purchaser or to a labor trafficker. I've worked abroad with victims of sex and labor trafficking, but some of the stories when I got back home and started working more locally, finding out that girls who went to my high school, were being trafficked, and just really being in the backyard, really being close to home, it really hit me. So I want to, just for purposes of this podcast, and I think this is something we'll revisit throughout our series as well, but I want to talk about the definition of trafficking. And Melissa and I, as we do trainings and different things, we always use the definition in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So this was set forth actually in the year 2000, which is
pretty recent.
Yeah, right. So people always ask, is this a new crime or whatever? This is not a new crime. I would say it's more newly recognized.
The label of human trafficking is new.
Right. So in the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, sex trafficking is defined as a commercial sex act that's induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act is under the age of 18. Now, labor trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through, again, the use of force, fraud, and coercion. And that's something that we'll talk about too. We'll go into more depth of what is force, fraud, and coercion. But this is for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery.
It seems like sex trafficking gets talked about more here in the U.S., but we know that labor trafficking definitely happens here. Some places that we know that it's happened has been like in the agricultural sector, nail salons, massage parlors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really any industry. I know here in Oklahoma, we've had a couple of cases more in the hospitality industry, maybe hotels, restaurants, that type of thing.
Yeah, it's so likely that pretty much everybody has actually come across a labor trafficking victim in their life if they're just out and about in the world. And then sex trafficking, I think a lot of people think of maybe people walking the streets or standing on a corner, but there's online is where a lot of that is going on. It does happen in hotels and motels and travel plazas and truck stops.
Yeah, casinos really can happen anywhere. And we always say just following things that we've learned from law enforcement and things that we've learned from actual survivors of sex trafficking, that this happens anywhere where there's a demand for illicit sex. So traffickers, we always say, are business people. They want to supply the demand. So they'll go any place where somebody is willing to purchase sex. So that can even be, I know we hear a lot about Super Bowl and soccer games and all these large sporting events. In Oklahoma, we talk a lot about casinos, but essentially we're talking about just meeting that demand.
And Dragonfly has served people who were trafficked in small rural places, hotels, like in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
Or even in their own homes, someplace in their own neighborhoods. It doesn't have to be some massive event.
Right.
It could really be happening literally down the street.
Yeah, that's really good.
And I hear a lot, people tend to think of human trafficking as happening to someone who was maybe kidnapped in Russia or the Ukraine or maybe Southeast Asia, brought to the United States for the purpose of trafficking. On the one hand, if someone has at least heard of that happening and recognizes that that's happening in the United States, that might be their first step to realizing that human trafficking is real and something that is happening here. But I feel like the next step is realizing that it's happening to American citizens. It's happening to teenagers. It's happening to adults, from anywhere, basically.
Right, right. And so we do acknowledge that it happens in that way, that people are brought from other countries to the United States. And we also have even cases recently in the news where people are being prosecuted for visiting other countries, like sex tourism. However, I think that people have this natural kind of mechanism of trying to distance this horrible thing from themselves. When really we have to acknowledge in the United States that it's happening. It's happening right where we are.
Right. The thing about these misconceptions is that we didn't just come up with them out of thin air. We've heard these misconceptions just talking to people, doing trainings all over the country. But then our answers to these misconceptions, we also didn't pull those out of thin air. We have a story actually of a girl, and her life kind of reflects all of these misconceptions. We're going to call her Ashley. Her name has been changed for her privacy, but this is a girl who was trafficked, and different aspects of her story, they touch all of these different misconceptions. And so this is a concrete, real example of everything that we're going to be talking about as we go through this Human Trafficking Awareness Month series.
Right. And so I want to mention too, just because you're on this, and I think we mentioned this in the last section, but we at the Dragonfly Home are passionate about learning from survivors. We recognize that they are the experts of the crime. They have survived this experience. And so these answers and the information we have is really based on that interaction and what we learned from people who have been through this.
So if we reiterate what this misconception is, right, that trafficking doesn't happen in our state and it certainly doesn't happen to American citizens. Well, Ashley was about 16 years old, living in a suburb of Oklahoma City. She'd had maybe a rough go of it in her young life. There was some turbulence in her home. Her dad was abusive to her mom, and she also suffered bullying at school, which, we hear more and more seemingly every day of just how prevalent bullying is and the incredible emotional toll that it can take.
Right. And so Ashley is struggling. She's struggling with her home life, and she's looking for validation. She's looking for attention and something positive, something to affirm her. So she goes on social media, and she's on Instagram, and she's on all these different Snapchat and different things. But she meets a guy, and this guy is indicating interest in her profile and giving her nice comments, and she loves that attention. And then really that's a red flag.
Yeah.
So traffickers tend to take advantage of vulnerabilities and exploit them. They attempt to fill any need that is there. And so when people put these things on social media, they're leaving this gap that really signals a trafficker to say, hey, this is an area that I can really swoop in on, for lack of a better word. So she is essentially, and she doesn't know this, but she's being recruited by a guy, and he lives in Oklahoma City. We'll call him Chris. And he is a friend of a friend. So she knows that they have these mutual friends. And so she doesn't really personally know him, but she feels like she can kind of trust him because they do have these mutual counterparts.
And he's from her town.
Exactly.
There's still this mentality of this is someone who I can relate to. It's someone who she could have really interacted with at any point in her life.
Right. So they're essentially building a relationship online, and we see this so often. So I always say in trainings that before, traffickers or pimps or these perpetrators would have to build relationships in person, and social media just changes the game. It makes trafficking more efficient, more effective, and they can really recruit and groom, 40, 50, how many ever girls or boys they want to online at the same time, saving a lot of time and energy. But they begin chatting and building this relationship, and he's reiterating things about, trying to isolate her from her family and saying that he can provide needs and that he can step in. So she begins really trusting him and kind of sees him as this Prince Charming or, kind of riding in on a white horse, saving her from her desperate situation.
And so that's kind of how their relationship got started. And we're going to go into more of her story, like I mentioned earlier. But I guess what we really want to drive home is she was a kid in a suburb of Oklahoma City, trafficked by a guy who was in Oklahoma City. So if you are in Colorado, if you are in Virginia or Washington, this is happening in a city near you or even a small town near you.
Agree.
So as we wrap up Misconception 1, we do want to mention it is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And, keep an eye out in your area. There might be some cool events going on. If you're in Oklahoma City, we do have a couple events that we want to mention to you.
Yeah, so January 11th is actual Human Trafficking Awareness Day. And so the Dragonfly Home will be hosting a kind of a rally, a community rally at Quark and Beans Coffee in Edmond. We are also planning the state's Candlelight Vigil for Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and that's typically held at the state capitol in the Blue Room.
And that's going to be on Friday,
January 27th.
There we go. If you want to keep an eye out for more events, we're going to be adding them. They'll be on our events page on our website, which is www.thedragonflyhome.org. On our next podcast, where we will be addressing our second misconception, we're going to be talking about whether trafficking requires travel. And we will also continue Ashley's story and how that relates to her.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate it.
We will see you next time. At the Dragonfly Home Human Trafficking Relief and Restoration Center, victim survivors of human trafficking from Oklahoma and beyond can find help to get a fresh start in life. Our mission is to provide non-residential services, intensive case management, and crisis intervention in a comfortable, home-like setting where victim survivors can access comprehensive services tailored to each individual. We also offer assistance and resources through our 24-hour confidential human trafficking helpline. The Dragonfly Home is a 501c3 nonprofit organization and is state certified by the Oklahoma Office of the Attorney General. For more information, visit www.thedragonflyhome.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.